welcome. I'm Danny McLoof, MBA class of 2002. I would like to welcome our three guest speakers for today, Urmi Samadar, Yasheng Huang, and Sharmila Chatterjee. So first is Urmi Samadar. She's the Director of Action Learning at MIT Sloan. Urmi provides strategic and operational leadership to the flagship Action Learning program that comprises a portfolio of 20 courses, engaging over 1,000 students in project-based learning that has impact in a third of the globe. Under Urmi's leadership, the Action Learning program has expanded its role to also provide intellectual leadership by undertaking research initiatives and developing case studies. Prior to Sloan, Urmi was a consultant for Oliver Wyman in New York and previously held roles in marketing and business development for a Bangalore-based mobile payment startup, a tech venture of ICICI Group, and Tata Interactive, a global leader in e-learning. Professor Yasheng Huang is a faculty of Global Economics and Management and Associate Dean for International Programs and Action Learning. He founded and runs the China Lab and the India Lab, which help entrepreneurs in these countries improve their management skills. In collaboration with other scholars, Professor Huang is conducting research on human capital formation in China and India, entrepreneurship, and ethnic and labor-intensive foreign direct investment. As the Dean of Action Learning, Professor Huang oversees the strategic and operational direction of Action Learning here at Sloan. Named by National Asia Research Program as one of the most outstanding scholars in the US, conducting research on issues of policy importance to the United States, Yasheng's research is regularly featured in the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Business World, Le Monde, The Economic Times, as well as in numerous Chinese publications. Last but not least, Sharmila Chatterjee is a senior lecturer in marketing and the academic head for the enterprise management track at the MIT Sloan School. A business-to-business marketing expert, she examines issues in the domains of channels of distribution, sales force management, and relationship marketing. In the area of sales force management, she carried out some of the first studies in the critical area of sales marketing interface, specifically sales lead management. Sharmila is interested in effective management of the sales marketing interface with a view towards appropriate allocation of resources between customer acquisition and retention activities. Our speakers today will highlight insights gained from a year-long study on the impact of action learning on various constituents, students, alumni, and host organizations, and on how alumni can be involved with the program. Please join me in welcoming Urmi Samadar, Professor Huang, and Sharmila Chatterjee.
Thank you so much, Danny, for that welcome. And actually, for traveling all the way from France, as a couple of our other guests over here are from. You know, it's a beautiful day in Boston and Cambridge, and you're with your friends and family, and you are part of this conversation today. So we are honored, and we hope that we're going to make the next 85 minutes, keeping to Sloan time, valuable for you. I wanted to also introduce you to my colleague, Joe Brown, who is the lead for data, technology, and infrastructure for Action Learning. And it's really important for the growth of where we want to take our program to. So with that, as Danny was talking about, just a quick show of hands. Was anyone involved in any of the Action Learning labs or any of the Action Learning courses while they were students here? Fantastic. We'd love to get you involved in this conversation and everyone else in this room. Action learning is a very important philosophy of teaching that we follow at Sloan School. And Professor Huang is going to tell us a little bit more about why we do this, why we are so deliberate about this choice of pedagogy at Sloan, which we believe is very closely aligned to the mission of our school. So on one hand, we are helping to train leaders in effective management philosophy and principles. And on the other hand, all these projects involved a host organization, someone we are actually working with, and we hope that we are able to add value to that whole process. So we're changing the world. That's what we like to believe. What we want to do today is give a quick overview of where action learning today is, take you through a bit more understanding of the philosophy of action learning, share with you some insights from a recent and the first empirical study that has been done in this field from management, for management education. And most importantly, as Danny said, get you involved in a discussion around how you as alums think about this and how you want to be part of this. I think the best part to start is captured in the voice of our students. And actually, one of our students was supposed to be in the room and be part of the celebrity, but he's not here. But let's get a sense of what this is all about.
I came to MIT because of the action learning labs. I had been writing case studies for nearly 4 years, but I needed to learn how to work on a team. I needed to learn how to work for a client. And so I came in knowing that I would do the enterprise management lab.
One of the reasons that I chose MIT was because there's such a emphasis on action learning. G-Lab is global entrepreneurship, and it's an area that I've always been interested in.
I like learning, and I guess I fit in with the MIT community in general on that front. But I think the thing that really excited me about MIT versus any other school was the real focus on sort of actually doing things. And I think that's really where channel-wide came in.
As an action learning student, I participated in the Israel lab. It was the most productive 3 weeks of my life. I work for a tech startup. They have a technology, they don't have a commercial solution yet, which was the whole point of the project. The problem statement was market entry in North America. The expectations were very high, and in the 3 weeks that we spent on site, we created the overall strategy, which I'm happy to report that they are implementing.
My team at MIT Sloan was doing that enterprise management action learning project with NASDAQ. And the impact of our team fundamentally was that we pointed to this new interesting market space where blockchain could be applied and where blockchain could potentially save the financial services industry billions of dollars annually.
The company that we worked with was Grupo Splice in Brazil, and we were tasked with the responsibility of helping Grupo Splice create a new product by leveraging the data that they have collected over the years in their traffic and data business and create a completely new business segment that they could take into the future. So we were able to create an automatic dashboard that was able to give predictive analytics for the government's use. And on the commercial side, we were able to create a variable messaging system, which is basically electronic billboards.
Our project was with a company called Huang, which is an educational technology company. They wanted to get into the educational consumer space, and they wanted to create an online store for educational products. And that was a really valuable experience to be able to actually sit down in Shanghai with the CEO and get a better idea of what she sees in terms of the direction of her company and how I might be able to work with my colleagues at Fudan University to create an actionable deliverable for how to go forward in terms of a go-to-market strategy for their new platform.
I was able to work with a real company, have the support of faculty as well as peers.
To actually go and deep dive into another culture and sort of experience firsthand what doing business in China is like, that's unique.
Action learning is an opportunity where you're given real responsibilities that will actually add very significant impact in a very short amount of time.
Action learning gave me a sort of wider toolkit so I could have a greater impact on the world. I got so much from the project, personally, professionally. I think it's been one of my greatest experiences at Sloan.
So learning beyond the classroom, learning and leading beyond the classroom being our theme is manifested into a portfolio of 15 plus courses that I don't know if any of these sound familiar with you. For those folks who raised their hands, some of you probably participated in these. And they're really not just regional or geographical focuses. Some of the ones have a very large footprint. We also have many of them that are multidisciplinary, some that focus on specific operations. And we keep thinking about what is the best way that we can continue to move this kind of teaching forward. A very large footprint, as we talked about, and as you might have seen in the slides before. But one point I want to mention over here is, even though we show a global map, the point of teaching action learning is not just for our students to be part of the global conversation. It's also to do a significant amount of work back home in the US, working with local organizations, both in Cambridge and beyond. As you can see, pretty good growth both in enrollment and courses. And while the northward movement of the graph is very exciting, what I wanted to point out particularly is these are all electives. So not only is Sloan thinking about how we should be teaching and advancing this practice forward, but our students are very excited about taking these courses and keeping this momentum going. So with that, let's understand a little bit more about what is this philosophy of teaching, and Yasheng's going to walk us through that.
Okay. Thank you, Urmi, for that introduction about scale and scope of action learning at MIT Sloan. I'm going to take you back a little bit to the early part of last century when there was a debate about management education. And the debate, the fundamental issue there is the management education, or should the management education be delivered in the same fashion, same model, same format as math, physics, literature, right? So that was the debate. And the conclusion of that debate was, no, it should not be, because management touches on practical issues, the real world, more than these other subject matters. And as a part of the resolution of that debate came the HBS case teaching method. Right? So essentially, the case teaching method is a way of connecting students sitting in a classroom to the world of practice and management. And then in the 1950s, there was another debate whether or not this way of teaching management education was too soft, was too atheoretical. Right? So whether or not it took us too far away from the classroom and without grounding the students in theories and in the frameworks and things like that. Actually, Ford Foundation did a big study. So as a correction to that, there was then a movement away from that, and there was a lot of emphasis on rigor and theory. To some extent, action learning is a way of trying to reconcile between the competing demands of teaching theory and the demands of getting our students out there in the world of practice. And we think, and we agree with the sort of the sentiment of the conclusion of the debate at that time, maybe case method was too atheoretical. But on the other hand, to get rid of interactions with the practice is really not the right way to teach management. So arguably, action learning is a compromise in terms of how we think about the right way to deliver management education. The term action learning was coined by this person, Reginald Revens, considered the father of, maybe grandfather of action learning. He coined that term. And there's an interesting MIT connection here. The famous MIT professor, the the father of cybernetics, Professor Norbert Wiener, apparently had a huge influence on the development of the thinking by Professor Rivers. Right? So there was, from the very beginning of action learning, there was an MIT connection. And then in 1964, some of you may know Professor Ed Roberts. He actually started, he didn't call the thing that he was doing action learning, but he started in essence what amounted to action learning in 1964, getting the students involved with the companies, teaching them, preparing them in classroom, theoretical framework and all of that, but then making sure they go out and practice the theories and the ideas in the real world. And then in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, Sloan sort of took this model to another level. It took Sloan a while, between 1964 and 1992, by creating the E-Lab. And today, we have, in a steady state, about 15 action learning courses. Urmi just quoted number 20. Now we are at 20, but every year there's up and down given different configurations. So in a steady state, 15, 16, 17, that's the level of action learning commitments, engagements we are talking about. So in essence, action learning is about a number of things. One is a project-based, right? Instead of writing an academic paper, right, we ask the students to get engaged with the company and give a deliverable to the company. So think about the stakeholders, the change in the stakeholders between classroom teaching and the action learning teaching, right? In the classroom teaching, you are accountable to the professor, right? I'm not saying being accountable to the professor is a bad thing. It's just, but it's a different thing from being accountable to managers and to the companies, right? So there are some fundamental differences between the kind of the stakeholders we are engaged with, and so there's an emphasis on project, and we make a very sharp distinction between internship and action learning, right? Internship involves students in their individual capacity working in a company at the direction of the company, right? Action learning is more similar to a consulting engagement that involves a team, and the team definitely listens to the company, listens to the management, but the team is not at the discretionary power of the company. The team sometimes, very often what we teach in action learning is that it is your right, in fact, it is your obligation to think about the larger interests of the company. And because you do that, you are fully empowered to stand up to the management and say your idea is wrong, right? This is fundamentally different between doing an internship in a company, and typically students there individually find it hard to challenge the management. Whereas a team, we empower the students as a team to actually challenge the management. Imagine doing that in the United States, in Silicon Valley, that's probably not a big deal. Imagine doing these things in those cultures that emphasize hierarchy, that emphasize authority and top-down management. It's actually very hard. And one of the long-lasting takeaways of action learning is for our students to learn how to say no to the management in those cultures that emphasize hierarchy without really offending the management, right? So there's a lot of a skill to be learned by doing that. In terms of, so even though we didn't coin the term action learning, right? It was coined in 1972, not by us. We believe that among business schools, I cannot say, among all the universities, but among business schools, Sloan really has some unique value propositions, right? And it is based on following fact. We have a longer history, right? A generous reading of the history will go back to 1964. A more stringent history, a version of the history will go back to 1992, right? Whether you pick 64 or 1992, we have done this far longer than any other management schools in the West. Right? So we have a longer history. We have a larger scale, right? So Urmi listed the number of the students, the number of projects, the number of the countries we touched. No other business school can claim that, at least not yet. We can also claim impact, right? Some of the companies we work with back in 1990s now are big companies now, right? So the developmental trajectory of these companies is something that we can associate with. I'm not saying that we get all the credit, but at least we began to work with these companies many, many years back, and now we can demonstrate that these companies have grown. The breadth, we have projects ranging from, actually the breadth is one of the most impressive things that has happened in the recent years. Before it was mostly marketing projects, maybe strategic management projects. Now we have analytics, we have technology, we have healthcare, right? No other business schools has the level of breadth in terms of the number of the projects, in terms of the types of the projects, in terms of the nature of the projects as we do. Global scope, right? So we go to 65 countries, something like that on average. Africa, Latin America, Asia. Asia is a big place, right? So I have a course that takes students to China and India. I always thought that going to one country with 1.3 billion people is not enough. Let's add another 1.2 and see what happens. And we have multidisciplinary approach, right? I come to action learning not so much as a marketing person, a finance person, but more as an economic perspective, a macroeconomic perspective, economic development perspective. But other professors come into action learning from finance, from marketing, from technology, from other disciplines. We have fairly clear pedagogical goals, right? We want to get our students in the real world. We want them to learn how to structure and scope problems, right? It's actually easier said than done, as many of you would probably know, to know exactly what the issue is facing the company. And sometimes the management actually doesn't have a very clear, they know that, oh, there's a problem out there, but there's not a clear formulation of what that problem is. And our students actually struggle to formulate what the problem is. And this is something you don't learn in a finance class. This is something you don't learn from a macroeconomics class or from a marketing class. This is something you learn by actually doing the projects, and actual learning provides the opportunities. And we also try to teach sessions to get the students to scope the projects better and more effectively. And learning to lead, right? Collaborate effectively. So this is a team engagement. You need to have a working relationship with your team members. And once you go out there, you need to have a working relationship with your clients, right? All these things, again, let me just repeat myself, you don't necessarily learn by taking notes from professors, right? Actually, professors are not known for teamwork, I have to say, by and large. Speaking purely about myself. Another really interesting part of the engagement is personal reflection. And it's really interesting and sometimes surprising when our students come back from an action learning engagement. They will say, oh, I learned about this company, I learned about this industry. Very often they say, I learned about myself. And I learned that that my culture is different from that culture. Oh, before I go to China, I had some vague idea about what Chinese culture is, but I really didn't have a concrete understanding of what that culture was, right? After being immersed in that culture, I came back understanding myself better, understanding my priors, cultural priors, my norms, much better than before I went there, right? I go to India, I get the same. So these are the things that we value a lot, right? And these are not, at least not automatically, the things you learn by taking a class on China, by taking a class on Indian economy, right? You have to be immersed in that culture to get that, the personal reflection and professional growth. In terms of what Urmi, Sharmila is also going to talk about a major initiative we are undertaking now. In terms of what we do now, is definitely we're going to organize action learning, offer action learning courses, better organize them, better engage with the companies to our students. We're also doing a bit of reflection ourselves, right? So now we have done so many years of action learning since 1992. We want to sit down and reflect on what we have done. And we have outlined a number of activities and engagements that we as leaders of action learning are now trying to do, right? They have to do with strengthening and improving operations of action learning. You know, the way I see it is that in the 1990s, we were a startup, right? It was very informal, right? One professor just get a whole bunch of projects, put the students in touch with the companies, and off you go. Now we are more of a corporation, given the scale at which we operate, right? So, but I have to say that for many, many years, we still have strong residues of a entrepreneurial operation rather than an entrepreneurial operation is not all bad, you know, initiatives, independence. But there are things that we believe that we need to standardize a little bit more, corporatize a little bit more, and maybe even centralize a little bit more, right? So in terms of operation, we're doing that. We're also coming out with policies, right, on multiple things. One simple example I want to give you is what happens to the data that you got from the companies, right? Who is going to sign the NDA, right? How do you deal with a tricky issue where the student agrees to take on an action learning project with the company X? It turns out the student, he or she already got an offer from company Y, which is a direct competitor with company X, right? Those are not the kind of issues we needed to think about back in the 1990s. Now we do, right? So we need to lay out more clear, explicit policies about these tricky issues. Practices, we need to showcase our impact by doing research on ourselves, right? Not just send the students to do research on the companies, we actually need to do research on how we have delivered action learning. And it is in that connection we're developing, even though we're not primarily known as a case writing school, we are writing cases that have to do with action learning because these are the type of cases that nobody else is writing. We want to showcase the best practices. Now we are operating 20 courses or 15, 16, 17 courses. Previously, it doesn't really matter. You just have one course or two courses. Communication is easy. Now it's actually very difficult, right? So how do we make sure that the best practice in one course gets transmitted to these other courses, right? So these are the additional activities that we are trying to do. So essentially, creating a platform for communication, for best practice, sharing of the best practices and ideas. We also want to communicate more effectively with the outside world, right? With alumni for sure, but with also other academic institutions, with industries, with organizations. And we want to be known. We're sort of known already as a leader, but we want to be even better known as a leader and as a thinker who has thought about the theoretical and practical issues involved in action learning, right? So we're not satisfied just being known, oh, Sloan has done a lot of action learning. They have done this in Latin America, they have done this in Asia, they have done this in other countries. We're not satisfied with just that reputation. What we want to do is we want the rest of the world to know that we have thought deeply about it. We have offered evidence in support of the benefits of action learning, and we have developed a framework how to organize action learning. So these are the things we're very busy with. Let me finish this slide and then invite Sharmila. So there's actually is a growing academic literature about action learning. And the action learning academic literature, the essence of that is that a lot of people are doing it, but nobody has a clue why it is a better and more effective way of teaching management. So we are the first, at least academic institution, right, trying to use data. Right? So this is MIT. We are not just happy with telling stories. We want the data to tell our stories. We are the first academic institution that is going to use data as a data-driven approach to study the practices of action learning and to estimate the impact of action learning and to learn from the things that we have done and from the mistakes, from the experiences, from the successes that we have achieved in order to do action learning better in the future, right? So let me turn to my colleague, Sharmila, who is now driving this study on impact.
Thank you, Yasheng. So thank you so much for being here. I'm delighted to share with you some preliminary findings of the study that we are undertaking to determine the perceived importance and impact of participating in action learning courses by three stakeholder groups: our students, our alumni, and host organizations. So one thing that I would love for you to do is please feel free to ask questions. I would love for it to be an interactive session as opposed to my, talking. As you have questions, some of you have participated. If you want to compare, contrast what you went through, and those who have not, if you have questions, please interact. We would love for it to be a much more interactive session. Just very briefly, what was our methodology? So we started with the literature review. We looked at the evolution of action learning as a pedagogical tool. And then we used that to develop our preliminary hypotheses. What are expected to be the perceived benefits of participating in action learning? Then there were two pieces of primary research. We did extensive depth interviews, about 30+ depth interviews. And then the insights from there fed into our survey to basically incorporate the holistic set of benefits that came out from our literature review and the depth interviews. Then we, of course, analyzed the data and developed insights vis-a-vis each of the hypotheses that we had developed. We also supplemented that with some data obtained from across admissions, career development office, SES, to look at the career-related impacts. And then last but not least, we actually spoke with our host organizations and faculty to assess the value created by our project teams for our host organizations. So that was primarily the methodology. So this touched a very broad cross-section of MIT. So students, faculty, alumni, host organizations and Sloan offices, like the Alumni Office, the Action Learning Office, and so on. So let me start sharing the data with you. So at the very beginning, we had asked our respondents as to what are some of the top 3 things that come to mind when you think of Sloan. And we are delighted to see that in our word cloud, action learning, so amongst other things, action learning is highlighted pretty significantly there. So, so that was just sort of our initial question that we asked of our respondents. Moving on to the perceived importance of action learning, this was an unaided recall. What we asked and so what we are doing here is have side-by-side data for alumni respondents and our current students, first and second years. And so the top 3 valuable learning experiences as they stated, and what we see is, of course, we are, classroom experience. Of course, we are MIT Sloan. We would expect classroom experience to be up there. And then action learning. So I will just explain the legend. The dark blue is the first most valuable. The lighter is second most valuable. And the teal is third most valuable. This color will run through and through the slides. And so action learning is amongst the top 5 classroom, Sloan culture, program structure, MIT ecosystem, action learning. And then, of course, we have the rest. Safe space, student-led experiences, and so on. This was, again, so the previous one, what's the difference here? This was unaided recall. We asked them to just talk about top 3. And this is aided in that they ranked each of the domains, and then they picked top 3 after they had ranked. And once again, action learning is the top 5. However, for alumni, action learning is number 2. So we are being conservative. For both groups, it's in the top 5. But for alumni, they are in the top 2. Students still number 5. So one of the things could be they are happier once they reflect upon it once they graduate. That's just a speculation. Maybe memories are fonder, or maybe you realize all the benefits later. Moving on, now we come to, so that's the importance. Now we move to the benefits. And we looked at 2 domains. We looked at the professional benefits and the personal benefits. So in the professional domain, we really wanted to see, so we have our pedagogical goals that has been developed by the Action Learning Office, and so we wanted to see how consistent are they, what they get vis-a-vis what our goals are. And when we looked at that, basically what we are seeing, oops, sorry, okay. So these were the domains that we looked at, and what we found, I should move to the next slide in a minute actually. What we find is that action learning, we took this is data, when we took the rating data, we basically analyzed it and we come up with 2 facets. The first facet has to do with capability development, and the second facet has to do with career advancement. So basically the previous factors that we looked at, they collapsed into 2 broad themes. Capability development are basically those that are aligned with succeeding in the long term in your careers. And career advancement is much more sort of shorter term. You are developing your network connections, and that you are sort of changing careers or help with changing careers and so on. And what we found was that our capability development facet or theme is the primary facet impacted upon by undertaking action learning courses, with a secondary impact on career advancement. So there was definite consistency and compatibility of taking action learning courses with our pedagogical goals, which we were, of course, very happy to see. Next, we come to personal growth. And here, interestingly, it is like the top three are identical amongst alumni and students. So bonding, worldview, dealing with ambiguity are the top three factors that emerged here. And these are very consistent. The top ones are very consistent across the two groups here. And what we find is that a lot of them, basically, it is incredible to see that sort of, our goal, that is, doing good in the world and dealing with a complex world, these are very much aligned with what we find our action learning courses doing. Next, we basically looked at our career transitions. We wanted to see what does action learning course participation do in terms of career transitions. We looked at three types of transitions. Most of our students make some kind of a change in their career. They either change their industry in which they're employed. So pre-Sloan versus post-Sloan industries could be different. Functional areas could be different. Or both could be different. So the majority of our students do make career transitions. So we wanted to see, does participation in action learning labs correlate positively with career transitions? And so what we find, though, that, so if we look, so what we call, so both is the dark blue is both. So career transition in both facets, industry and function. The lighter blue is functional transition. Industry is teal, and the yellow is none. So what we find here is undertaking action learning labs, there is directional support, that there is some, is it in the right direction, but we don't find statistical significance here because, so it could be there's a ceiling effect that most of the students are doing some kind of a transition anyway. So even those who are not doing labs are making transitions is slightly higher for lab takers, but not statistically significant. So majority, as I said, Sloan students change industry or function anyway, so we could run into your ceiling effect. And so this is very consistent with what we found earlier, though, and that's the good news. What we found earlier was action learning's primary value lies in capability development and only secondary impact on recruitment. Given that this career transition data is very consistent with what we found originally. Then we wanted to look at satisfaction data. And we basically adapted the ACSI, the American Customer Satisfaction Index, to look at the lab takers versus non-lab takers. So took AL, the darker bars are took AL, did not take AL, are the lighter bars. Again, what we find is statistically they are similar. For the student population, though, there's a marginally statistical significant difference between the two, but not for alumni. And even though for students, it's only marginal. And then last but not least, we wanted to look at referrals data. That are lab takers more likely to refer MIT Sloan. And again, we see there is directional support for lab students having higher likelihood. But the thing is that, again, the referral likelihood is so high. I mean, it's basically concentrated in 6 and 7. So it's very, very high. So we are very happy with the satisfaction referral data. Where could the non-lab takers go, given that, everyone wants to recommend and is happy? So that's what we are finding in our data here. And so there's just one additional piece of data after which I will pass the slide floor to Urmi to wrap up. So perceived value of hosting action learning projects. So we went to the students at Alumni and we basically asked, how likely are you to host such projects? 83% of alumni see high value in hosting and 77% of students. So very high value for hosting projects. So thank you for your support here. Appreciate that. And so now I would love to pass the floor to Urmi to wrap up. Yes, please.
What about data on host organizations?
And that is exactly coming up. Yes, thank you.
So thank you, Sharmila.
That's the perfect segue to the next segment.
So much. So Danny,
Thank you.
very quickly though, I mean, the way we were looking at the impact on students and alumni is more empirical. However, if you think about looking at impact for a host organization, and I know we were talking, before the session started about potentially, if I was thinking about hosting, how do I study that impact? The context is very different for every organization. So the way we are studying the host impact is looking at the context in which, good to see you, hi, the context in which the host project has been set up. And so I'll give you an example which is very topical. The work that our students did had an immediate impact on the organization, also because of the political and economic changes in India last year. But then we'll open it up to the thoughts that you have, and we want to hear from you. So this is a company called Paytm. It's Alibaba invested. It is in India. It's India's largest commercial platform. Has anybody worked with the Paytm team? No. Okay. Paytm actually stands for Pay Through Mobile. That's the acronym for it. And as you can see, we've been working 6 consecutive years for this organization. Started with its market entry strategy to global diversification portfolio strategy. But what's very exciting is something recent that happened, and I want to share that story to show you why the impact of these projects really, it's not a consulting report as Yasheng was talking about, it actually makes a difference to your organization. So India, as you largely know, is a predominantly cash-based transaction, cash-based economy. And in 2015, one of the projects Paytm did was, with MIT Sloan, was, well, let's look at the merchants who are largely in this offline space and see if we can convert them into the mobile platform, or the mobile payment platform. And when the demonetization was announced last year by Prime Minister Modi, this was an amazing opportunity for Paytm to cash in on that. And actually, today, one of the recent stats that their VPs shared with us is they are increasing merchants by 100,000 a week. 100,000 a week. Their target is 500 million users in the next couple of years, and we feel actually pretty good being part of that story. So this is how we are capturing the impact stories, not by just an empirical measure, but into context of where was it applied, why was it useful for that organization. At this point, I'd love to invite those of you who did action learning in any format. Do you want to share a bit of your stories, how you and your team added value to the organization? And a couple of you had raised hands, so if any of you felt that this was a great experience, would you like to talk a little bit about it? Did you raise a hand? No? Or you kind of did? Okay, I forced you to. So maybe let's go with that. What's your name, sir?
Paul Choi, class of 2007.
Great.
I did my G-Lab in Istanbul.
Lovely.
With restaurant culture.
Mm-hmm. You had good food.
Yeah, indeed. We had free food for the whole entire month. It was not a cheap food. It was a pretty upscale restaurant. And they were thinking about going overseas. Our project was to formulate a strategy to take the Turkish restaurant outside of Turkey. They had around 10 restaurants around Turkey. It was founded by 4 cousins. So it was a partnership between those 4. So, I mean, it was great. I mean, all four of us never visited Turkey before, and the host was very enthusiastic to introduce us not only to his business but the culture in Turkey, and we were featured in the front page of the biggest newspaper in Turkey. I think it was called Hurriyet. So because of this publicity, when we went to a bar, there were some Turkish people that recognized us. So they immediately said, "Oh, I saw you in newspaper. You guys are from MIT." So it was a great experience. So eventually, I think they did another. We were the first MIT Sloan doing the project for that restaurant chain, and I believe class of 2008 also had a team that gone there, and they eventually set up a restaurant in London, Greece.
Wow.
I think they have one somewhere in New England.
Wow.
Later, so I guess it worked, or
I guess it did.
It's a great
And,
experience. Yes.
Thank you for sharing that story. And one of the things we probably have to add to our goals for action learning is the celebrity status that it also gives you as a part of. But thank you so much for sharing that story. And market expansion and global expansion growth strategy has been a consistent theme for several action learning courses, definitely the ones that Sharmila and Yasheng lead. If any of you want to share any other stories, that would be fantastic for the group here. Wonderful. Thank you. You can tell us your name and which year you're from.
Damian Fernandez, class of 07. My G-Lab team went to New Zealand. We were there for 3 weeks working for a high-tech startup based in Wellington in the North Island. And when we went to the company was 6 months away from running out of cash and folding. And so we came up with an idea on how to, we created like a different pricing architecture so they would be able to expand the market, the addressable market that they had without losing revenue and margin on the higher end side of their product. And they are still in business, so it's exciting that they survived.
They survived. That's a lovely pricing and revenue model design that you all did for them. Thank you again. Yes, Yasheng.
So one interesting note on G-Lab is that G-Lab usually just goes to developing countries, except for New Zealand.
Yes.
Either because there's something special about New Zealand, or MIT believes that New Zealand is a developing country.
At the time that we went there, the New Zealand government was funding our project.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's right. So
Exactly
there
right.
was a there was
Wow,
there was a partnership.
Yeah.
Correct.
that's fantastic. It's lovely. Thank you so much for sharing these stories, which we did we have another hand?
Yeah.
Great, that's wonderful, thank you.
I'm Naoki Matsunaga. I'm from class of 2016, so I just graduated a year ago.
Yay, welcome back. Welcome back to everyone.
So we went to South Africa for the company called Frankie Africa, that is called kind of geotechnical company, kind of construction company. So they're kind of has their major share in South African market, but because of the growth of South African market slows down, they wanted to have kind of growth strategy to go outside of South Africa, I mean the other sub-Saharan African countries. So we are tasked to do kind of market entry strategy. So what we did was like to hear what's their business development people is feeling about the other countries, and we also gathered kind of quantitative data. So eventually what we did was more like validating what they are thinking, rather than establish something new. What we find out is they probably didn't know what they needed to do or where is the best market, but they didn't have kind of quantitative data or hypothesized story that to be explained to themselves internally or their shareholders. So what we did is kind of validate and kind of create story to everybody in an organization to understand. So since we did the Jira Black 1 or just 2 years ago, they are still developing stories. So I checking their website periodically. And it seems they did some project in a country we recommended. So
Fabulous.
I think they're implementing a strategy. That is kind of professional side of the story. But to be honest, what was really good was they invited our team to kind of field trip for every weekend, like safari or kind of Cape Town with very beautiful places. So that was really good experience for me.
Can't beat an African safari. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing these stories, which really what we wanted to talk about is, as you are, you're alums and you are in a position to think about advancing this practice, this community of practice that we are trying to create. As Yasheng mentioned, we're not just wanting to be, we are one of the leaders in this field, but we just don't want to do that in isolation. We want you to go back to your organizations and talk about this principle of management education that needs to be recognized as well. I mean, today if we talk about case studies, people understand that, or simulations. But if you say action learning, you do have to say a few more sentences before your managers or your colleagues will understand those terms. So we'd love to have you involved in advancing that community of practice. We would love to think that you may want to consider hosting one of these projects, which we believe should create value for you. And those are the kind of dialogues we would want to engage with as we are thinking about our alumni being involved in this conversation. We're also very candid about where we need to continue to evolve, and this is consistent across several years that we would need to do probably a better job in not just scoping these projects, but also helping our students to scope and structure these projects so that they could be a little more impactful right from the start. And there is always this notion about, can we improve the way we match our teams to projects? And you can't beat the African experience or the Turkish food. And there are a lot of reasons why some projects get more popular than others, and this is a continuously evolving process. We'd love ideas on where you think we can improve. We would, I'll come back to this slide because this is sort of captures a little bit of what we talked today. But we'd really love you to think about how can you help us advance this community of practice, and what are some questions that you have in mind at this point that Joe, Yasheng, Sharmila, and I can help, and Dave and Kristen, who are very much part of this conversation from the Office of External Relations. So open to questions from your side, comments, thoughts, anything for any of us at this point. Yes? Kristen, you're going to get your workout done today.
Hi, thank you. My name is Luis Sayon. I'm Sloan Fellow, class of 16. So it's great to be back with my classmates here. I guess, so I did Israel Lab.
Yeah.
And this was the year that Israel Lab was the very first cohort going out with Dean Cohen. Great experience. I guess some feedback in terms of how you think about engaging with companies. If you say you are the leader, and I believe that MIT is the leader in this sort of thinking, you need to approach the situation, both the engagement as a leader. In my experience, we were a little bit more kind of gun shy, I think, about how we engage the potential customers. Now in Israel, very intense entrepreneurial community, right? So we went and worked with a lot of startups. In my case, I worked with probably the largest company in Israel that was looking at a strategy to both adopt startup best practices and potentially also acquire. So it was kind of an interesting balance between being from a large corporation, but looking at the sort of innovation landscape. But my comment goes to, if you say you're the leader, act like the leader, right? Harvard doesn't do this. and other leading universities don't do that, right? So you have to treat this more like a true consulting engagement, right? I mean, at some point there was talk about the students even sharing a room, which, that shouldn't even be part of the equation, right? It should be, these are the terms, company A, if you want to get MIT Sloan students here. Because largely these people are going to come with some level of experience. Now, the Sloan Fellows, we have on average about 10, 12 years of experience. So that was, to me, almost a turnoff to not go on this trip. And I sort of had to kind of help both my classmates and the faculty think a little bit like the leader. Do you know what I mean? And I guess I'll say one more thing around the engagement piece. It's all in the brand and in the name, right? Action learning is a very important part of what we do here. But I think from a company perspective, you have to think about, well, why am I going to invest, right? Fly all these students to the place of the engagement and have them learn, right? That seems less attractive than essentially, calling a middle of the road consulting company to do that project, right? So, I mean, I think it's important that you engage the alumni because we know and have been in the shoes. But as you go and promote this, perhaps it's more, it's a different angle in which you're not so much learning, but you're executing, right? You're actually executing what you learn in the classroom. I think in that case, you may find a little more reception if you're having trouble in getting that engagement with companies.
So thank you for sharing that candid the note. And Yasheng, I know probably you want to talk a little bit and respond to that. I think, so the one thing is that at this point, the struggle is not about finding the opportunities of engagement. In fact, it is the opposite. We actually have to turn away a lot of organizations because people want to work with smart people like you and with the access of having MIT. So that our problem is not that we don't find enough qualified candidates to work with us. Our problem is this is not a methodology, this is not a term that is widely understood by the business and the management community globally. You understand case studies, you understand simulations, business modeling, but you don't necessarily understand action learning. But to your point, you had 2 points over there. One was around treating this as a consulting engagement and therefore, sort of the associated logistical elements along with that. And the other point was, well, if it is a consulting engagement, then just kind of act as a leader and come in strong in terms of what we want to. So on the logistical fronts, the improvements continue to happen. It's really an equation of funding that goes into these projects and the capability of these organizations to be a part of this. We do not want to be a consulting organization, and I'll let Yasheng actually talk about that. And there is because of the philosophy of what we are trying to do. But I hear your point around articulate better what's the value, what's in it for them. And I think hopefully we would be able to articulate that more with the stories that we take to them. By engaging with MIT students, you are actually getting 4 or 5 best minds who are working on very interesting ideas. They're bringing that to your table. You are also getting access to some of the brightest faculty and research through this process. And you're getting a perspective that is different, and it's probably going to challenge you a little bit more because you're not really engaging them as a consultant. This is going back to what, Yasheng, you were talking about. Maybe you want to qualify this aspect a little bit.
Yeah, so I think the 2 points you raised are very good points. And so I'll address the second first and the first second. The second point about, I think your larger point is absolutely correct, right? We need to build our brand. We need to do a better job in terms of educating what action learning specifically entails. People know about MIT, people know about MIT Sloan, but exactly how action learning as practiced by us is or is not, I don't think there is a common sort of foundation of understanding. So we definitely need to do that more. And I do want to emphasize the point that Urmi already made, which is that we are now operating with the difficulty we have now is we're running out of the students rather than running out of the projects. That may or may not be the right situation to be in. This is related to your first point, which is maybe some companies we shouldn't work with them at all, right? So demanding, students to share a room and things like that, we shouldn't work with them at all. So I actually think we shouldn't work with those companies which have a view that all we do is a low-cost consulting service to them, right? So we want to engage with companies that understand the model of action learning that has both a intervention component, which is that we provide ideas and recommendations, but also there's a very important educational component. What we have found in our empirical analysis is that we tend to work better with MIT alumni because they understand our model. They also understand the larger purpose of action learning, which is partially educational, right? Not 100%, but partially educational. And they want to give back to MIT by hosting a team, providing them explicitly with an educational experience. On top of that, get very good advice and recommendations from the team. On your first point, I think we definitely take your point very, very seriously, and we do need to do a better job, what is known as a sorting, right? So we need to know what's the motivation of the company when the company comes to us and asks for a team. Is the motivation just for a low-cost consulting? They might have gone to McKinsey, but McKinsey has a higher cost proposition. We have a lower cost. That's not our sweet spot, right? So we're not really, we purposely don't charge a lot of money for educational motivations. We can come back and debate whether or not that's the right thing to do. I know that Wharton charges very, very high prices for their global consulting practicum. Right, practicum. But the fact is that they get, when I ask them, how many projects you get, we get so many projects. Like sometimes in a good year we do 6, right? So that's not really, we can't really scale when you do that, and so we don't charge a lot because we want to go to the small and medium entrepreneurs and help them grow. And we sometimes work with big companies, but our primary audience is small and medium entrepreneurs. And small and medium entrepreneurs do have a pricing capacity limitation. So we don't want to. So you say we should act as a leader. That's true. We should act as an intellectual leader. Whether or not we should act as a pricing leader, that's something that we can have a legitimate debate on, because we don't want to be viewed as a low-cost McKinsey substitute, right? So one of the ways we differentiate ourselves is that our students are more empowered to challenge the management, and we don't look for anything in return from you, right? So we're less deferential to the host company than a economically motivated consulting company would be otherwise, because they have to think about long-term relationship with a client, long-term relationship with the management. We don't actually need to think about these things. Even though we don't need to think about these things, we get repeat customers year in and year out. Paytm, we work with them for 6 years. There's a company called the Credit Ease in China. We worked with them beginning in 2009, probably. And last year was the only year we didn't work with them. Now they are, who is the Credit Ease? They're the biggest P2P organization in the whole world. They do $10 billion of business. They came to us every year in and year out, right? So Sharmila is the marketing expert, I'm not. So what I heard from people who know about marketing, a good metric is repeat customers. They come back to you and they get value from you. So definitely I take both your points very, very seriously, and there are some issues we need to think about for sure. Thank you for that.
Part of that point was the MIT readiness for an organization as well. I want to be mindful of the time, and I also know this is a beautiful day and you want to be outside. But as we wrap up, any last couple of thoughts? We have some handouts, just an overview document about what action learning is. If you want to take this for any of your colleagues back home, that would be great. Our email ID is really easy to remember. It's actionlearning@mit.edu. So if you would like to send us any comments, thoughts, please do share that with us.
Urmi, can I say this as a parting comment?
Absolutely.
Let me say action learning is expensive. This is very subtle, So, well, let me be concrete. So, if you think about lecture class, right? You have a professor, you have a TA. Actually, at HBS they don't even have TAs. They don't have teaching assistants, and that's it, right? So essentially, one professor can teach a class of 80. Because I was a professor there. There you had one professor vis-a-vis 80 students. Action learning is extremely labor intensive. We have, for my own course, China and India Labs, I have 7 mentors, right? 7 mentors. These are successful business professionals, successful entrepreneurs who come back to us and they mentor teams of students. Our norm is that each mentor shouldn't mentor more than 3 or 4 teams, right? Because there's no economy of scale in mentoring. And so we have, FTEs, fully engaged FTEs. Each course, so China India Lab, we have about 70, 80 students. Instead of one professor, we have, on top of a faculty member, I'm the faculty member, we have 6 or 7 mentors, right? So think about the cost structure. And going back to your point, we don't charge very, very high price deliberately because we want to work with small, medium, growing entrepreneurs. So think about the gap that the school has to cover, right? And so part of my job is to go out and talk about action learning and to get the support from alumni. We're very fortunate, and Dave and Kristen have been working very hard on this. We're very fortunate we have both alumni and friends of MIT who have been very, very supportive of action learning. In part, actually, they are very enthusiastic about supporting entrepreneurial development. Entrepreneurial development in China, entrepreneurial development in Latin America, in India. They view that action learning as a way to help those entrepreneurs. As we know from economic research, it's not only the big companies that power economic growth. It's really the collective effect of millions of small and medium entrepreneurs that power economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasheng. And on that very subtle note, thank you all for being part of this conversation, for your ideas, and I hope we'll hear from you more ideas. And if you have to, some of you might be thinking about your own organization, please reach out to us and let us help in that conversation. Thank you so much for being part of this session. Enjoy your next couple of days. This is brilliant. Thank you.